The sun rose over the small African village, spilling golden light across the dusty roads and the roofs of thatched huts. The air carried the scent of earth and freshly cut grass, mingling with the distant sounds of roosters crowing and children laughing as they ran barefoot to fetch water from the nearby stream. The village seemed peaceful to an outsider, but beneath the calm surface, whispers drifted through the air, soft as the rustle of leaves, hinting at secrets that no one dared speak of too loudly. Among the villagers, life followed a rhythm as old as the soil itself, with women tending to their families, men working the fields and children chasing one another in playful abandon. Yet, something unusual lingered, something subtle but unsettling, coloring the otherwise bright and cheerful days with an edge of quiet suspicion. She walked along the narrow path that wound between the huts, her feet barely disturbing the fine dust, her presence commanding attention without effort. At 27, she was a vision of beauty and grace, with clear, unblemished skin that glowed in the morning sun and sharp features that spoke of both intelligence and determination. Her eyes, dark and observant, seemed to notice everything from the flutter of a bird's wings to the faintest movements among the villagers. Her hair, long and neatly braided, swayed gently with each step, catching the sunlight and sending specks of gold dancing across her shoulders. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her every movement precise, yet there was an innocence about her that drew others in, a kindness that made her approachable despite the curiosity she stirred. Her mornings were spent walking to the market, greeting neighbors and helping her mother prepare food. She exchanged smiles and soft words with the merchants and other women who gathered to gossip about daily life, the prices of yams and millet, or the latest happenings in families nearby. But her interactions were never purely casual. She had a habit of listening closely, noticing the slight tension in voices, the hurried glances, and the whispers that trailed off when she approached. The villagers spoke freely among themselves but never fully trusted one another, and she had begun to sense that some things were meant to remain hidden. Some elders shook their heads at one another with knowing expressions when she passed, and children would quickly avert their eyes as though afraid that speaking too loudly about certain matters might summon trouble. Despite the laughter and chatter that filled the village, she could not ignore the unease that had begun to settle over the community. Stories of strange occurrences had started to drift into her awareness. Tales of women's clothing being moved or damaged in ways that seemed unnatural, rumors that some men were not entirely honest with their intentions, and hints of a secret influence that touched the most private corners of a woman's life. People spoke in hushed tones, casting wary glances over their shoulders, as if even the air carried the power to betray them. The whispers seemed small at first, harmless enough to dismiss, but they clung to the edges of her thoughts, persistent and unnerving, until she found herself noticing details she had never paid attention to before. The way a laundry line sagged as if weighed by invisible hands, the subtle stains that appeared overnight, the faint marks that hinted at mischief carried out when no one was watching. She moved among the village unaware of the depth of the secret that shadowed her steps, her heart light and trusting, yet her senses sharpened by instinct. The village, vibrant and full of life, hid layers beneath its cheerful facade, and she was about to discover that the smallest, most personal of things, her clothing, the garments closest to her body, were not entirely safe. The sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the huts and fields, but in the quiet corners where shadows lingered, an unseen presence watched, waiting for the moment when her innocence would collide with the hidden truths of the village, truths that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the people she trusted and the world she lived in. Each morning, she rose before the sun had fully claimed the sky, the soft hum of the village slowly waking around her. She slipped out of her hut barefoot, careful not to wake her younger siblings, and made her way to the well, balancing a clay pot on her head with practiced ease. The rhythmic clink of the pot against her skin was accompanied by the murmurs of early risers, women who already began their chores, filling the air with warmth and familiarity. She greeted the familiar faces with a soft smile, her voice gentle but carrying a subtle confidence, a voice that made even strangers feel at ease. Fetching water was never simply a task. It was a time for observation, for listening to the village, for noticing the shifts in moods and the faint whispers that danced on the breeze. Her mind, always curious, pieced together fragments of conversation, stories half-spoken and expressions that held secrets. After collecting water, she wandered to the market, where the aroma of fresh cassava, yams and roasted grains mingled with the dusty scent of the sun-baked earth. She moved with a grace that drew attention but never arrogance, pausing to exchange small tokens and coins with the merchants, always careful to haggle politely yet firmly. Friends and neighbors called out her name, inviting her to linger, to share a laugh or a bit of gossip, and she indulged them with her warmth. She had an independent spirit, one that refused to be confined to the expectations of women in the village. Her curiosity pushed her to ask questions, to explore corners of the market where traders kept rare herbs and strange trinkets, often attracting amused glances from elders who had long given up on trying to tame her inquisitive nature. Among the familiar faces, a few individuals stood out. There was her younger brother, a mischievous boy who adored his sister yet often left trails of trouble in his wake. Her mother, kind but weary from years of labor and care, watched her with quiet pride and a hint of concern, sensing the strength she carried within. And then there was the old woman who lived near the edge of the village, draped in worn, colorful cloths that whispered of a time long past. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried weight, tinged with riddles and warnings. The protagonist felt drawn to her, curious about what lay behind her knowing eyes, though she never dared to ask too much, sensing that some truths were dangerous to uncover too soon. As she moved through her day, a subtle unease lingered at the edges of her mind. Laundry lines stretched across the courtyards, adorned with garments swaying gently in the breeze, yet they seemed to harbor secrets of their own. Sometimes a cloth would appear slightly out of place, a thread caught where it shouldn't be, or a faint stain that was never there the day before. She would glance around, searching for an explanation, only to find empty spaces and knowing eyes peeking from behind hut walls. It was as if the very air of the village carried whispers of things unseen, and though she remained unaware of the full danger, her instincts told her that not all was as innocent as it seemed. Even in her playful interactions with friends as they traded stories and laughter, the shadows of unseen hands lingered, silent but watchful, threading tension into the otherwise ordinary rhythm of her life. One morning, as she approached the small courtyard behind her hut where the laundry lines stretched between wooden posts, she noticed something unusual. A light breeze rustled the garments, but it could not explain the way her clothes seemed slightly displaced, as if someone had adjusted them in secret. A faint tear marred the hem of her favorite dress, and a small smudge of dirt had appeared on the fabric where none had been before. She frowned, crouching to examine the garments more closely, her mind racing for an explanation. Perhaps it was the wind, or perhaps a careless neighbor's child had brushed past. She shrugged it off, pushing the uneasy feeling to the back of her mind, unwilling to let suspicion cloud the bright morning. As the day unfolded, she began to notice other small irregularities. Threads appeared frayed that had been whole, tiny stains marked places that had always been clean, and even the soft cotton of her undergarments, something she had always taken care to protect, seemed touched by an unseen hand. She could not quite believe it. The idea that someone in her own village would meddle so intimately felt impossible, almost unthinkable. Yet, as she moved through the market and exchanged greetings with friends and neighbors, she overheard whispers that made her pause. Women huddled in small groups, voices low, their heads bent close together. They spoke of garments mysteriously torn or dirted, of missing pieces that appeared days later in the oddest of places. Their eyes darted toward her as she passed, silently questioning if she too had noticed these strange happenings. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was coincidence, that the village was simply alive with the ordinary mischief of everyday life. Perhaps her neighbor had borrowed her cloth and forgotten to return it neatly. Perhaps the children had trampled through the courtyard while playing. Yet, the stories of other women gnawed at the edges of her mind, persistent and impossible to ignore entirely. The village, so familiar and safe, began to take on a strange, uneasy tone, where ordinary sounds, the creak of a door, the swish of a dress on a line, seemed to hold hidden meanings. She noticed the way the older women exchanged knowing glances, how a hushed cough or sudden silence followed her presence, and how even children seemed to watch her more intently than before, as though sensing that she, too, might become aware of what had long remained hidden. Her thoughts returned often to the laundry lines behind her hut, the very place that had once symbolized the simple rhythm of life, now tinged with an almost imperceptible threat. Something was happening there, something she could not yet see clearly. The small signs, easily dismissible at first, began to accumulate, each one a subtle clue pointing toward a secret she was not yet ready to confront. She felt a growing sense of vulnerability, a realization that even in a village she had called home all her life, there were spaces she could not trust entirely. The invisible hands that seemed to touch her clothing left traces not only on fabric but on her mind, threading doubt and unease into her once unshakable confidence. Despite the creeping fear, she carried on with her day, her curiosity and independence still driving her actions. She laughed with friends, helped her mother with chores, and moved through the market with the same grace she had always known. Yet, a quiet alertness settled over her, a readiness to notice the subtle signs that something in the village was not as ordinary as it appeared. The ordinary smiles of neighbors now carried a hint of caution, the songs of children a faint edge of warning. She told herself it was coincidence, that the strange disturbances were nothing more than accidents and playful tricks, but deep inside, a tiny ember of suspicion had been lit. It would grow slowly at first, until she could no longer ignore the presence of a hidden force that watched, manipulated, and waited, its motives cloaked in secrecy, ready to touch the most private corners of her life. That day the sun was high and hot, casting sharp shadows across the village paths and making the air shimmer with heat. She carried her basket of laundry to the communal drying area, the familiar place where women from neighboring huts hung their garments to sway in the wind. The clatter of pots and the distant hum of voices greeted her as usual, but a strange tension seemed to hang over the space. She approached her section of the line, expecting to find her clothes arranged just as she had left them, neatly draped and drying in the sun. What she saw instead made her stop dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened in disbelief. The delicate cotton of her underwear, something she had always taken great care to keep clean and private, had been tampered with. Small stains marred the fabric, faint but unmistakable, and tiny threads had been pulled, knotted, or twisted in ways that made her stomach churn. She reached out with trembling fingers, half hoping that her eyes were playing tricks on her, half knowing deep down that the damage was real. Each mark seemed deliberate, a message hidden in the ordinary folds of fabric, as if someone had deliberately invaded the most private part of her life. Confusion washed over her, followed quickly by a cold, sharp fear. Who could have done this and why? The thought of someone touching what was so personal, so intimate, sent a shiver down her spine and made her heart pound violently against her chest. As she stood frozen, a few friends arrived at the line. Their expressions shifted the moment they saw her face and the state of her laundry. Some rushed forward, clutching her hands and whispering words of comfort, urging her not to worry, insisting that it could not have been intentional, that perhaps it was an accident. Their voices were soft, shaky with empathy, yet even in their attempts to console her, a hint of fear lingered in their eyes. Others, however, a few women who had long kept their distance, looked away quickly, avoiding her gaze and offering no words at all. It was as if acknowledging the incident might somehow summon the very mischief they all feared, and silence became their shield. She felt a strange mixture of isolation and betrayal, realizing that even among those she trusted, fear could overshadow support. Amid the murmurs and shifting glances, the old woman appeared, her steps quiet but deliberate, her presence commanding without a word. She stopped beside her, eyes narrowing slightly as she examined the garments, and a faint, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "There are things in this village that do not wish to be seen," the woman said softly, her voice carrying weight beyond mere words. She did not elaborate, did not explain what had been done or why, but the implication was clear. This was not an ordinary prank, nor a simple act of carelessness. The protagonist felt the old woman's gaze pierce her, filled with both warning and something else she could not yet name, perhaps respect, perhaps a hint of promise. Her mind raced as she held the damaged laundry close, trying to make sense of what had happened. The village, so familiar and vibrant, now seemed layered with secrets, hidden currents of mischief and malice that she had only begun to glimpse. Every face around her carried a story she had yet to uncover, every gesture seemed to. After the shocking discovery, she could not shake the sense of intrusion that had settled deep in her chest. Each day she moved through the village with a heightened awareness, her eyes scanning familiar paths and faces for clues, her ears attuned to whispers that once might have escaped her attention. She began her investigation quietly, careful not to alert anyone who might be involved, and even more careful not to appear suspicious. Her curiosity, once playful and innocent, now carried the weight of necessity, a silent urgency that demanded she uncover the truth behind the mysterious tampering of women's clothing. The village, which had once felt open and familiar, now seemed layered with hidden patterns, and each movement of her neighbors took on new meaning. It started with small observations. Certain men, who had always been casual figures in the background of daily life, seemed to linger longer near the communal drying areas than necessary. Their glances were never blatant, always fleeting, but she caught them more than once, eyes narrowing as they followed the sway of the garments. Some appeared genuinely occupied with conversation or work, yet the timing of their appearances and the subtle shifts in their body language betrayed an unusual interest. The pattern was too deliberate, too consistent to ignore. She began taking mental notes, remembering who approached the laundry lines and at what times, noticing the faint smirks or the way their eyes flickered toward women's private garments. By night, when the village was quiet and most lights had been extinguished, she began to observe from hidden corners. She crouched behind baskets or crouched low in the tall grass, keeping her distance while the moon cast silvery light over the drying clothes. Shadows stretched across the courtyards, and every movement became amplified in her mind, every rustle of fabric potentially revealing a secret she was desperate to uncover. Sometimes men appeared, moving with care to avoid detection, their hands brushing against garments as if they were performing some ritual only they understood. Her heart would pound in her chest, a mixture of fear and indignation, but she forced herself to remain still, silent, watching, documenting each act with her mind. The cool night air felt heavy with tension, the usual chirping of crickets and the distant howls of nocturnal animals a backdrop to the unfolding mystery. Through her careful observation, a shocking realization emerged. This was not a random act or an isolated incident. It had been happening for years, targeting women's undergarments in secret. Her mind raced as she recalled the whispers of other women, their voices trembling with a mixture of shame and fear, and she began to see the full scope of the violation. The pattern stretched across decades, a hidden current running beneath the surface of the village life she had always known. Anger bubbled within her, sharp and consuming, mixing with a deep sense of betrayal. How could this have been allowed to continue unnoticed, hidden in plain sight, affecting so many women? Fear crept alongside her anger, the knowledge that she had become a target adding weight to every step she took. Shame and confusion tangled with her emotions, forcing her to question not only the actions of others but her own place within the village. She had trusted her neighbors, walked among them with open eyes and heart, and yet, in the most intimate corners of her life, she had been violated. She struggled to reconcile the warmth of familiar faces with the sinister reality she was uncovering. Some days, the weight of secrecy threatened to crush her, the knowledge that even mentioning the acts might endanger her or others, leaving her isolated with her thoughts. Yet, beneath the fear and confusion, a growing determination began to take root. She could no longer ignore the injustice, and the very act of observing, of noticing, became her first step toward reclaiming control. The more she watched, the clearer the patterns became. Certain days, certain men, even specific gestures repeated themselves, each act building upon the last, forming a tapestry of hidden misconduct. Her anger grew hotter with each discovery, her fear sharper, and her resolve stronger. She understood, in the deepest part of herself, that exposing this secret would be dangerous, that the hidden forces behind it were both cunning and deeply entrenched in the village life. But she also understood that she could not turn away, not now, not after seeing the extent of what had been done. Every fiber of her being demanded that she seek the truth, that she uncover the motives behind the tampering, and that she protect herself and the women whose lives had been quietly touched by violation. Each night, crouched in the shadows, her resolve hardened, and the mixture of anger, fear, shame, and confusion fueled her determination to bring the hidden currents of the village into the light. As her investigation deepened, she began to sense that the strange occurrences surrounding the laundry lines were not merely acts of mischief or voyeurism. There was something else, something older and darker, something that belonged to a realm she had never dared to imagine. Whispers from the old woman, glances from those who dared not speak, and the patterns she had meticulously observed all pointed to a truth that stretched far beyond ordinary human behavior. One evening, under the silver glow of the moon, the old woman finally spoke more plainly, though still with careful restraint. "There are threads in this village that do more than weave cloth," she said, her voice low and trembling with both warning and reverence. "They carry power. Threads that touch the body can touch the spirit, and some hands use them for things they should not." The protagonist listened, heart pounding, as the old woman revealed fragments of the village's secret. Long ago, the ancestors had discovered that threads could be imbued with mystical properties, enchanted to influence luck, fertility, and the unseen energies that governed daily life. At first, these enchantments were used sparingly, with caution and respect, to bless crops, protect families, and ensure harmony. But over the centuries, the knowledge had splintered. Some men, tempted by selfish desires, began to use the enchanted threads in ways that violated women's privacy, manipulating garments to gain power, luck, or influence over their targets. Others continued the original purpose, performing ancient rituals intended to honor spirits, ensure fertility, or balance the fortunes of the village. The boundary between sacred magic and corrupt manipulation had blurred, leaving the village vulnerable to secrets and shadows that no one dared name. She tried to grasp the enormity of it, her mind racing. Every small mark, every slight alteration to her clothing, could carry intention and consequence far beyond her comprehension. Threads that seemed harmless, cotton, silk, or wool, were vessels of unseen energy, conduits for forces that could touch a woman's body, her luck, or her fate without her knowing. Even the smallest disturbance in these garments could carry significance. A stolen stitch, a knotted hem, a stain applied in secret could be a blessing gone awry or a curse hidden in plain sight. She realized that the men she had observed had not merely been curious or mischievous. They were wielding powers they barely understood themselves, playing with forces that were as dangerous as they were invisible. The folklore she had grown up hearing, once dismissed as bedtime stories or old superstition, suddenly took on a new weight. Tales of spirits that roamed the village at night, guardians who punished the careless, and curses that could follow families for generations were no longer stories. They were warnings, histories encoded in myth, now manifesting in the manipulation of the mundane. Laws that had long governed behavior, both written and unwritten, were tied to these practices, ancient rules that dictated who could wield power and who must remain ignorant. Knowledge of the threads was forbidden for ordinary villagers, a secret to be guarded or hidden, for to understand too much without guidance could be catastrophic. The very act of learning the truth, of observing and investigating, placed her in danger, both from those who sought to control the magic and from the spirits that enforced the old laws with unseen rigor. She felt a shiver run through her as the old woman's words settled over her. The village, she realized, was a place alive with unseen forces, a realm where the ordinary and extraordinary intertwined in ways that demanded respect, fear, and vigilance. Her emotions twisted together: fear of the magic she did not yet understand, anger at those who had misused it, awe at the depth of its power, and a creeping sense of responsibility. The knowledge she had uncovered was a weight, an inheritance she had not chosen, but it was hers nonetheless. She could not undo what had been done, nor could she ignore it, for the threads had already touched her life, marking her as both witness and participant in the delicate, dangerous balance of the village's mystical order. Even as she struggled to comprehend, she began to see patterns where none had been visible before. Certain men's actions were guided by selfish desire, manipulating garments for personal gain, while others conducted rituals under the cover of darkness, calling on spirits with chants and gestures that had been passed down for generations. The consequences of these actions were real and immediate, affecting luck, fertility, and the unseen currents of life that flowed through every villager. She realized that to navigate this world, to protect herself and perhaps even reclaim her agency, she would need guidance, courage, and wisdom. Yet, the very act of knowing the secret placed her at the edge of danger, and each day she walked the line between curiosity and peril, her mind both captivated and haunted by the hidden magic that wove through the fabric of the village, unseen but undeniably present. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on the village, and she felt a tension in the air that matched the tightness in her chest. She had spent weeks observing, piecing together the subtle signs, following threads of suspicion that led her to one particular man who seemed to linger longer near the laundry lines than any other. His movements had been too deliberate, his glances too calculating, and something about the way he handled his daily tasks suggested an awareness that went beyond casual curiosity. Today, driven by a mixture of anger, fear, and the need for answers, she decided she could wait no longer. She would confront him and demand the truth. She found him near the edge of the market, counting small coins and exchanging goods with a merchant. Her approach was quiet at first, but when their eyes met, she felt the familiar thrill of tension prickling along her spine. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that fluttered in her stomach. "I see you at the drying lines, and I know the women's garments are not safe from you." The man's expression flickered briefly, a subtle tightening around his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a calm smile. "I don't know what you mean," he replied smoothly, dismissing her accusation with the air of someone who had done nothing wrong. "You must be mistaken. Perhaps it's your imagination." Her anger flared, hot and consuming, but it was tempered by the caution that had grown in her over weeks of observation. She could not afford to act recklessly. This man was not only capable of deceit, but he was also tied to forces she had only begun to understand. The threads, the rituals, the ancient magic. Any accusation could draw the attention of the spirits or invoke the wrath of those who wielded the village's hidden power. Yet, her desire for justice, for recognition of the violation that had touched her and countless other women, surged stronger than her fear. She pressed on, her words firm. "I've seen you. Others have seen you. This cannot continue." Before the confrontation could escalate further, villagers began to gather nearby, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and fear. Elders shook their heads, warning her in hushed tones. "Do not interfere," one whispered urgently, a tremor in his voice. "Some things are not meant to be understood. The spirits watch, and those who meddle may bring curses upon themselves or face exile. Leave it be." Others cast quick glances toward the man she accused, subtly reminding her of the social hierarchies and unspoken rules that governed village life. Every word, every movement, carried consequences she could not yet predict, and the weight of tradition pressed heavily against her resolve. Her mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Part of her longed to demand answers, to expose the wrongdoing and reclaim what had been taken from herself and other women. But another part, the part shaped by years of living within the village, feared the consequences. The anger of men who controlled both power and superstition, the possibility of social ostracism, and the danger posed by the spirits who enforced ancient laws with unseen authority. Her pulse quickened, and a chill ran down her spine as she realized that her pursuit of justice was no longer a simple moral choice. It was a dance along a razor's edge, balancing courage against survival. The man continued to meet her gaze with calculated calm, his denial unwavering, but she saw something in the faintest twitch of his hand, the way his eyes darted for a split second, that confirmed her suspicions. He was not entirely human in his certainty. He moved as someone protected by unseen forces, someone emboldened by the knowledge that the threads and rituals shielded him from casual scrutiny. Her heart thudded in her chest as she weighed her next move, understanding that speaking too loudly, acting too boldly, could ignite wrath not only from the man but from the invisible powers that governed the village's hidden magic. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and taut, filled with the unspoken threat of both human and mystical consequences. The villagers' eyes followed her, some wary, some sympathetic, but all cautious. She felt the pull of two worlds, one demanding justice, one demanding obedience to forces she barely understood. Her hands trembled slightly, and a shiver of anticipation mixed with dread ran through her. She knew that this confrontation was only the beginning, that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, and that her own courage would be tested in ways she had never imagined. Yet even with the fear she could not turn away. The threads of injustice, both literal and metaphorical, had wrapped themselves around her life, and she would find a way to unravel them no matter the cost. The day after the confrontation she felt the weight of unease pressing heavier than ever. The village seemed quieter, as if holding its breath, and even familiar faces carried subtle caution in their expressions. It was then that the old woman appeared at her hut's doorway, her presence commanding and serene, as though she had been waiting for this precise moment. "You have seen too much to turn back now," the woman said softly, her voice layered with both warning and reassurance. "But seeing is not enough. You must learn, or you will be lost to the currents that move unseen in this village." The protagonist's heart raced, a mixture of relief and apprehension flooding her. For the first time she felt that guidance, wisdom, and perhaps even protection might be within reach. The old woman led her to a hidden corner of the village, where a small, shadowed hut stood apart from the familiar paths. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs, earthy soil, and faint incense smoke, and the walls were lined with bundles of threads, charms, and trinkets that glimmered faintly in the dim light. The woman revealed herself not merely as a keeper of stories, but as a protector of women's secrets, a guardian who had long ensured that the village's mystical threads were not misused. She spoke of the enchanted threads, explaining in intricate detail how they could manipulate fortune, influence desires, and even invade the privacy of the wearer when woven into garments with intent. Each thread, she explained, carried energy, subtle and powerful, responsive to ritual, intent, and the hands that touched it. The protagonist listened with rapt attention as the old woman began to teach her ways to protect herself. She introduced charms fashioned from herbs and small woven cords that could be placed within undergarments to shield the wearer's energy. She explained the use of protective powders, sprinkled carefully in laundry baskets or along lines, to confuse and deter those attempting mischief. Certain clothing, when sewn with specific knots and symbols, could carry protective energy, rendering garments resistant to tampering. The rituals were precise, performed at specific times of the day or under particular phases of the moon, and required focus, discipline, and respect for the unseen forces they invoked. 4 days the protagonist trained under the old woman's watchful eye. She learned to weave protective knots, to chant subtle words of power that infused the threads with energy, and to prepare herbal mixtures that could safeguard her clothing and her own presence. At first, her hands trembled and her chants faltered, but with each repetition her confidence grew. She began to feel a connection to the magic itself, understanding that it was not merely about defense but about attuning herself to the unseen currents of the village. Where she had once felt vulnerable, now a spark of control and knowledge began to take root. Her training was not only physical but mental. The old woman stressed the importance of awareness, intuition, and observation, teaching her to notice subtle patterns, shifts in energy, and the intentions of those around her. The protagonist's sharp mind, once attuned to ordinary village life, now expanded to perceive the hidden layers of influence and manipulation. She practiced protective rituals quietly, repeating knots and chants under the moonlight, feeling the threads hum faintly with energy. Each success, each small moment of mastery, brought a sense of empowerment she had never experienced before. Where fear and confusion had once dominated, now a cautious confidence settled within her, tempered by the understanding that the magic she wielded demanded respect, focus, and vigilance. As the days passed, the village no longer felt quite as oppressive. The protagonist carried her training in her mind and in her garments, moving through her routines with the knowledge that she was no longer entirely defenseless. The old woman, ever patient and deliberate, reminded her that mastery would take time, but that even small steps could shift the balance of power in subtle ways. She began to see herself not just as a victim of hidden manipulations but as a participant in a larger story, one where courage, wisdom, and careful action could reclaim what had been violated. With each protective charm, each ritual completed, and each knot tied with intent, the protagonist felt the first stirrings of strength, an inner power that would carry her into the challenges to come. The day after the confrontation, she felt the weight of unease pressing heavier than ever. The village seemed quieter, as if holding its breath, and even familiar faces carried subtle caution in their expressions. It was then that the old woman appeared at her hut's doorway, her presence commanding and serene, as though she had been waiting for this precise moment. "You have seen too much to turn back now," the woman said softly, her voice layered with both warning and reassurance. "But seeing is not enough. You must learn, or you will be lost to the currents that move unseen in this village." The protagonist's heart raced, a mixture of relief and apprehension flooding her. For the first time she felt that guidance, wisdom, and perhaps even protection might be within reach. The old woman led her to a hidden corner of the village, where a small, shadowed hut stood apart from the familiar paths. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs, earthy soil, and faint incense smoke, and the walls were lined with bundles of threads, charms, and trinkets that glimmered faintly in the dim light. The woman revealed herself not merely as a keeper of stories, but as a protector of women's secrets, a guardian who had long ensured that the village's mystical threads were not misused. She spoke of the enchanted threads, explaining in intricate detail how they could manipulate fortune, influence desires, and even invade the privacy of the wearer when woven into garments with intent. Each thread, she explained, carried energy, subtle and powerful, responsive to ritual, intent, and the hands that touched it. The protagonist listened with rapt attention as the old woman began to teach her ways to protect herself. She introduced charms fashioned from herbs and small woven cords that could be placed within undergarments to shield the wearer's energy. She explained the use of protective powders, sprinkled carefully in laundry baskets or along lines, to confuse and deter those attempting mischief. Certain clothing, when sewn with specific knots and symbols, could carry protective energy, rendering garments resistant to tampering. The rituals were precise, performed at specific times of the day or under particular phases of the moon, and required focus, discipline, and respect for the unseen forces they invoked. 4 days, the protagonist trained under the old woman's watchful eye. She learned to weave protective knots, to chant subtle words of power that infused the threads with energy, and to prepare herbal mixtures that could safeguard her clothing and her own presence. At first, her hands trembled and her chants faltered, but with each repetition her confidence grew. She began to feel a connection to the magic itself, understanding that it was not merely about defense but about attuning herself to the unseen currents of the village. Where she had once felt vulnerable, now a spark of control and knowledge began to take root. Her training was not only physical but mental. The old woman stressed the importance of awareness, intuition, and observation, teaching her to notice subtle patterns, shifts in energy, and the intentions of those around her. The protagonist's sharp mind, once attuned to ordinary village life, now expanded to perceive the hidden layers of influence and manipulation. She practiced protective rituals quietly, repeating knots and chants under the moonlight, feeling the threads hum faintly with energy. Each success, each small moment of mastery, brought a sense of empowerment she had never experienced before. Where fear and confusion had once dominated, now a cautious confidence settled within her, tempered by the understanding that the magic she wielded demanded respect, focus, and vigilance. As the days passed, the village no longer felt quite as oppressive. The protagonist carried her training in her mind and in her garments, moving through her routines with the knowledge that she was no longer entirely defenseless. The old woman, ever patient and deliberate, reminded her that mastery would take time, but that even small steps could shift the balance of power in subtle ways. She began to see herself not just as a victim of hidden manipulations but as a participant in a larger story, one where courage, wisdom, and careful action could reclaim what had been violated. With each protective charm, each ritual completed, and each knot tied with intent, the protagonist felt the first stirrings of strength, an inner power that would carry her into the challenges to come. The calm she had begun to cultivate through her training with the old woman was shattered one morning when subtle signs of danger crept into her life once more. It began with her clothing. Despite the protective charms woven into her garments, she found her underwear, once private and shielded, marked with fresh stains and oddly twisted threads. The disruptions were no longer minor. They were deliberate, aggressive, and pointed, as if the unseen hands behind the enchanted manipulations were sending a warning. Each new mark left her stomach tightening, a visceral reminder that her investigation had not gone unnoticed. Someone, or something, was aware of her efforts, and they were retaliating with an intensity that forced her to recognize the full danger of the village's hidden magic. It was not only her garments that bore evidence of the escalating threat. Shadows moved unnaturally across her courtyard at night, the soft rustle of fabric seeming to follow her from room to room. The air sometimes carried whispers she could not trace, murmurs that seemed to echo from unseen mouths, warning her, mocking her, or threatening consequences she could not yet comprehend. Small objects shifted inexplicably, tripping her feet or sliding from surfaces when no hand had touched them. The village, which had once felt familiar and safe, now seemed alive with forces that she had only begun to understand, each one capable of influencing her life in subtle and terrifying ways. She realized that what had once seemed like mischief was, in truth, part of a dangerous, long-standing secret, maintained over generations with precision and care. Even her closest friends began to betray her, consciously or unconsciously. Some avoided her gaze, muttering hurriedly when she approached, as if their presence might invite the wrath of forces they did not dare name. Others whispered behind her back, questioning her actions, warning her not to meddle in things that exceeded the understanding of ordinary villagers. The isolation pressed in around her, suffocating and relentless. She felt the sting of betrayal, the weight of solitude, as those she once trusted for laughter, comfort, and counsel became distant or suspicious. Each encounter left her heart heavier, each friendly word now carrying a hidden undertone of fear. The village was no longer just a place of familiar faces and bustling markets. It had become a labyrinth of eyes, whispers, and unseen energies, all of which conspired to keep its secrets hidden. Her emotions shifted constantly, fear mingled with anger, confusion with determination. She recognized the power the men wielded, not just over garments but over perception, tradition, and the spirits that governed the hidden magic. Each aggressive act against her clothing, each supernatural ripple in her environment, reinforced the reality that she was entangled in a web far larger than herself. The threads of manipulation, once subtle and nearly invisible, now wove a pattern she could not ignore. The men were emboldened, their actions no longer restrained by the caution that had once marked their movements, and the unseen magic responded to their intent with a force that unsettled her deeply. Yet, despite the fear and isolation, she did not retreat. The old woman's teachings echoed in her mind. Awareness, precision, and respect for the magic were essential to survival. She reinforced her protective charms, tightened knots, and refined her rituals, seeking ways to shield not only her clothing but her own spirit from the intrusive energy that pressed against her. Still, every small victory brought a fresh surge of tension, a reminder that she was being tested by both human and mystical forces. She understood that failure could have consequences far beyond embarrassment or discomfort. Curses, misfortune, or even social exile were very real threats in a village where magic and tradition were intertwined. As the days passed, the escalation became undeniable. The patterns she had observed before, the careful timing and subtle movements, now erupted into open displays of intrusion and intimidation. The village itself seemed to shift around her, as though the balance of power had tipped and the protective layers of secrecy had been stripped away. She walked the line between courage and fear, knowing that any misstep could provoke the wrath of the men or the spirits that upheld their practices. Yet, deep inside, a stubborn resolve burned brighter with each new attack. She would not allow the long-standing secret, maintained through generations of manipulation and fear, to continue unchallenged. The danger was real, the threat immediate, but so too was the growing power within her. The knowledge, skill, and resilience that had been nurtured in the shadows by the old woman, now ready to face the escalating storm that threatened both her body and her spirit. The night was unusually still, the village wrapped in darkness, the only light a pale, trembling moon. She moved carefully through the narrow paths, her feet silent on the dusty ground, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and anticipation. For weeks, her observations, combined with the old woman's guidance, had led her to fragments of a hidden truth, hints of ceremonies and manipulations that extended far beyond simple mischief. Tonight, she would witness the ritual itself, a secret performed for generations in the shadow of the village's daily life. She crouched behind the thick foliage near the edge of the communal courtyard, her breath shallow as she waited for the figures to arrive. The men she had observed before approached quietly, carrying bundles of women's underwear wrapped in cloth. Their movements were ritualistic, careful, precise, as though every gesture had been drilled into them over decades. Each step seemed measured against an unseen rhythm, and the air itself seemed to hum with a subtle energy, charged and oppressive. They arranged the garments around a small fire, circling it with solemnity, chanting words that she could not fully understand but felt deep in her chest, vibrating with power and intent. The purpose of the ritual slowly became clear. This was not casual or selfish play. These garments, taken without consent, were vessels, used to manipulate luck, control fertility, and subtly influence the fortunes of women across the village. The implication struck her like a physical blow. For centuries, her ancestors and countless women before her had been subjected to the whims of hidden magic, powerless to resist. Her stomach turned as the men continued, weaving the garments together with threads that glimmered faintly under the moonlight. Each knot was deliberate, each placement precise, connecting energy, intention, and consequence in a web invisible to the ordinary eye. Some men muttered incantations intended to bind the spirit of the wearer, others whispered words of control over their health, relationships, or luck. The garments, once private and innocent, were transformed into conduits of power and subjugation. She could hardly breathe as she realized the scope of the centuries-old secret. This practice had been meticulously maintained, hidden behind ordinary village life, protected by fear, superstition, and the authority of those who understood the thread's power. The horror of the discovery pressed down on her. Women she had known all her life, perhaps even her friends and family, might have been unknowingly caught in the currents of this dark magic. The realization of the violation, of the control exerted over bodies and lives without consent, filled her with disbelief and rage. Her mind raced, imagining the countless women over generations whose fates had been subtly altered, their lives steered by the secret rituals performed under the cover of night. Yet amid the terror, a spark of determination ignited. She would not be just another passive witness. The knowledge she had gained, dangerous and forbidden though it was, could become her weapon. As the men concluded the ritual, leaving the garments arranged in patterns that seemed to pulse with hidden energy, she glimpsed the final act. A dark, silent invocation, binding the spells, sealing the garment's purpose until the next moon cycle. The consequences were immediate and tangible. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, the energy of the ritual lingering in the courtyard like a low hum pressing against her skin. She realized that interfering with this process carried immense risk. The men, the magic, the ancestral forces intertwined in ways she could only partially comprehend, and the spirits who governed these rituals would punish any disruption harshly. Yet, the injustice, the centuries of covert manipulation, demanded action. Her mind was a storm of fear, disbelief, and fury. She pictured the women of the village, their lives subtly controlled, their fortunes and fertility manipulated by forces beyond their understanding. Every fiber of her being trembled with the knowledge of what must be done, yet she knew the path forward would be treacherous. To stop the ritual, to protect herself and others, she would have to navigate not only the men's cunning but the ancient, unforgiving magic that governed the practice. Every step would require courage, precision, and the careful application of the skills and protective knowledge she had gained under the old woman's tutelage. By the time the men departed, leaving the ritual site cloaked in shadow and lingering energy, she stood hidden in the dark, heart-pounding, mind-racing. Horror, disbelief, and determination warred within her, forging a resolve stronger than she had ever known. She would no longer be a passive witness. The secret of the enchanted threads, the manipulation of women's garments, and the hidden control over lives would not continue unchallenged. The centuries of quiet subjugation, cloaked in superstition and secrecy, had met their first adversary, and she was determined that justice, protection, and liberation would follow.